In the summer of 1973, a federal mail truck disappeared into the Denver morning with $2.7 million in cash and securities. No shots were fired, no alarms sounded, and no witnesses came forward. The crew vanished without leaving behind a single fingerprint, a traceable vehicle, or even a credible description. For over 5 decades, the case remained one of Colorado's most perfectly executed unsolved crimes. But in 2024, during the renovation of a modest duplex in Aurora, a contractor's sledgehammer broke through more than just drywall. What emerged from a sealed attic compartment wasn't treasure, but it was enough to crack open a mystery that had stayed buried for 51 years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the morning of August 14, 1973, at precisely 6:42 a.m., a white Postal Service truck rolled quietly through the industrial district of northeast Denver. The vehicle carried more than letters and packages. Secured in reinforced canvas bags were federal tax deposits, Social Security payments, and Treasury bonds totaling $2.7 million collected from processing centers across the Rocky Mountain region. The truck was scheduled to make 3 routine stops before reaching the main postal facility downtown, where the cargo would be transferred to armored transport for final delivery to the Federal Reserve. The driver, a 15-year postal veteran named Robert Sinclair, had run this route dozens of times without incident. His partner, mail clerk Danny Reeves, sat in the passenger seat reviewing delivery manifests. Both men understood the value of their cargo, but neither expected trouble. Federal mail trucks rarely attracted attention from criminals. The security protocols were straightforward but effective: multiple locked compartments, irregular timing, and radio contact with dispatch every 30 minutes. At 6:55 a.m., the truck made its first scheduled stop at a distribution center on Colfax Avenue. The exchange took 4 minutes. Sinclair and Reeves loaded additional packages and continued eastbound toward their second stop. Radio contact with dispatch was normal. The truck disappeared somewhere between 7:10 and 7:25 a.m. along a stretch of industrial road lined with warehouses and loading docks. When the truck failed to arrive at its second stop by 7:30 a.m., the facility supervisor placed a call to postal headquarters. Initial assumptions centered on mechanical failure or traffic delays, but when radio contact attempts went unanswered, a search was initiated. By 8:15 a.m., patrol units were canvassing the road. The truck was discovered at 8:41 a.m. in an empty lot behind a closed auto parts store, its rear doors standing open and its cargo compartments stripped clean. Sinclair and Reeves were found bound with industrial rope in a storage shed approximately 200 yards from the abandoned truck. Both men were conscious but disoriented. Neither had sustained serious injuries, though Reeves showed signs of a mild concussion. Their accounts of the incident were consistent but offered little useful information. According to their statements, the truck had been flagged down by 2 men wearing postal uniforms who claimed to be conducting a security inspection. The men had approached the driver's side window and asked Sinclair to step out of the vehicle. When he complied, one of the men produced a handgun and ordered both postal workers to move away from the truck. The robbery proceeded without violence or panic. The perpetrators worked efficiently, transferring the secured bags to a waiting van while keeping the postal workers under guard. The entire operation lasted less than 10 minutes. The crime scene yielded almost nothing. No fingerprints were recovered from the truck's interior or exterior surfaces. The rope used to restrain the victims was standard hardware store material, untraceable and sold at dozens of locations throughout the metro area. The storage shed where the postal workers were held showed no signs of preparation or prior use. It appeared the location had been selected spontaneously. chosen for its isolation rather than strategic planning. The FBI assumed control of the investigation within hours. Agent Patricia Holbrook, who had worked similar cases across the Mountain West, noted several unusual aspects of the crime. The perpetrators had demonstrated detailed knowledge of postal security procedures, including radio protocols and cargo manifests. They had worn authentic-looking uniforms and carried official-appearing identification. Most significantly, they had targeted a specific truck on a specific day, suggesting inside information about the cargo's unusual value. The $2.7 million haul was extraordinary for 1973. Most mail trucks carried modest amounts of cash and routine correspondence. This particular shipment included quarterly tax deposits from several Colorado counties, making it worth nearly 10 times the typical cargo value. The timing suggested the perpetrators had advanced knowledge of the shipment's contents and schedule. Holbrook's team interviewed every postal employee with access to routing information. They examined recent personnel changes, reviewed security clearances, and conducted background checks on temporary workers and contractors. The investigation expanded to include truck maintenance staff, dispatchers, and administrative personnel. No red flags emerged. Every employee interviewed had solid alibis and clean records. The search for the getaway vehicle proved equally frustrating. Witnesses reported seeing a dark-colored van in the area around the time of the robbery, but descriptions were inconsistent. Some recalled a blue Ford, others a black Chevrolet. License plate numbers were either unreadable or led to dead ends. The vehicle had apparently been chosen for its anonymity, blending seamlessly into the industrial landscape. Physical evidence was virtually non-existent. The perpetrators had left no shell casings, no clothing fibers, and no personal items. They had avoided touching surfaces that might retain fingerprints and had worn gloves throughout the operation. Even the ground around the crime scene revealed nothing useful. The August heat had baked the earth hard, preventing clear footprint impressions. The FBI's behavioral analysis suggested a crew of 3 to 4 individuals with military or law enforcement backgrounds. The operation's precision, the use of authentic uniforms, and the absence of panic or violence all pointed to professional training. The perpetrators had studied postal procedures, identified vulnerabilities in the security system, and executed their plan with surgical precision. Local media coverage was intense but provided no useful leads. The Denver Post ran daily updates for weeks, appealing for witnesses and offering rewards for information. Television news broadcasts featured interviews with postal officials and security experts. The story captured public attention, but no credible tips emerged from the coverage. As weeks turned to months, the investigation stalled. The FBI had interviewed over 200 people, reviewed thousands of documents, and followed dozens of leads. None produced actionable intelligence. The perpetrators had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The money, the weapons, and the van all remained untraceable. By early 1974, the case was unofficially considered cold. Active investigation continued for another year, but resources were gradually reassigned to newer cases. The file remained open, but hope for resolution had dimmed. The robbery had been too clean, too professional, and too well planned to crack through conventional investigative methods. The case occasionally resurfaced in local news, usually around anniversaries of the crime or when similar robberies occurred elsewhere. Retired FBI agents would sometimes reference it in training seminars as an example of nearly perfect criminal execution. But no new evidence emerged, and no credible confessions were ever made. The missing $2.7 million had significant impact beyond the immediate theft. Postal security protocols were overhauled nationwide. Radio check-in intervals were shortened, cargo manifests were classified at higher levels, and armed escorts were required for high-value shipments. the Denver robbery had exposed systemic vulnerabilities that extended far beyond Colorado. For the families of the postal workers involved, the crime left lasting effects. Both Sinclair and Reeves returned to work after brief medical leave, but the psychological impact persisted. Sinclair retired early, citing stress-related health issues. Reeves transferred to an administrative position, unable to continue working routes that reminded him of the incident. The case file, eventually transferred to the Denver Police Department's cold case unit, filled 3 storage boxes. It contained witness statements, forensic reports, surveillance photographs, and hundreds of pages of investigative notes. The material was meticulously organized but ultimately inconclusive. Every lead had been exhausted, every theory explored, every possibility investigated. In 1998, the 25th anniversary of the robbery prompted a brief, renewed investigation. New forensic techniques were applied to old evidence, and digital databases were searched for potential matches. The effort yielded nothing significant. The perpetrators had simply been too careful, too thorough, and too disciplined to leave recoverable traces. The Denver mail robbery became a legend within law enforcement circles, studied by investigators and cited in academic papers about organized crime. It represented the gold standard of unsolved cases, a perfect crime that had defied decades of professional investigation. The perpetrators had achieved what most criminals only dream of: complete escape without detection or consequence. But legends, no matter how carefully constructed, sometimes contain hidden flaws. And in 2024, during the mundane renovation of a forgotten duplex, one of those flaws would finally surface. The contractor's sledgehammer that broke through the attic wall wasn't just demolishing old construction. It was about to demolish 51 years of silence. The duplex at 1847 Maple Street in Aurora had seen better days. Built in 1962, it had housed dozens of tenants over the decades, from young families to elderly retirees. The current owner, Maria Santos, had purchased the property in 2019 as an investment, planning to renovate and flip it for a modest profit. The work had been delayed by the pandemic, supply chain issues, and contractor availability. By spring 2024, the project was finally underway. The renovation crew, led by contractor Jake Morrison, had been working on the property for 3 weeks. They had gutted the kitchen, replaced the flooring, and were in the process of opening up the cramped living spaces to create a more modern layout. The attic had been largely ignored during the initial phases of work. It was a typical crawl space, accessible only through a narrow opening in the hallway ceiling, filled with decades of dust and forgotten insulation. On the morning of May 23, 2024, Morrison climbed into the attic to assess the electrical wiring. The space was larger than expected, extending over both units of the duplex. As he maneuvered through the cramped area with a flashlight, he noticed an irregularity in the wall structure. What appeared to be a standard interior wall showed signs of modification. The drywall seemed newer than the surrounding materials, and the seams were less weathered. Morrison called down to his assistant, Tommy Chen, who joined him in the attic with the additional lighting. Together, they examined the suspicious wall section. The drywall appeared to have been installed over an existing opening, creating a sealed compartment roughly 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The work was professional, but not original to the building's construction. Someone had deliberately concealed whatever lay behind that wall. Using a reciprocating saw, Morrison carefully cut through the drywall. The blade encountered resistance after penetrating about an inch, suggesting additional materials behind the outer layer. As he widened the opening, a musty odor emerged from the cavity. The smell was old, but not unpleasant, like aged paper and fabric that had been sealed away from air circulation for decades. Chen aimed his flashlight into the opening as Morrison pulled away larger sections of drywall. The cavity contained a collection of items wrapped in plastic sheeting and secured with deteriorated rubber bands. The plastic had yellowed with age but remained intact, protecting the contents from moisture and dust. Morrison carefully extracted the largest bundle, a rectangular package roughly the size of a shoebox. The two men climbed down from the attic and spread the materials on a work table in the garage. Morrison photographed everything before unwrapping the bundles, a precaution he had learned from previous renovations where historical items were discovered. The first package contained what appeared to be official documents. Their edges brittle, but their contents still legible. The papers were photocopies of Postal Service routing schedules, dated August 1973. The documents detailed truck assignments, cargo manifests, and security protocols for the Denver metropolitan area. Several pages contained handwritten notes in the margins, including specific times, locations, and personnel assignments. The handwriting was precise and methodical, suggesting careful study rather than casual observation. A second bundle contained newspaper clippings from August and September 1973, all related to the Federal Mail truck robbery that had made headlines throughout Colorado. The articles were carefully preserved, arranged chronologically, and included coverage from multiple newspapers. Someone had been following the story closely, collecting every available detail about the investigation and its progress. The most intriguing discovery was a small spiral notebook, its pages filled with the same handwriting found on the postal documents. The entries were dated, beginning in June 1973 and continuing through October of that year. The notes were cryptic, but clearly related to the planning and execution of some kind of operation. References to the route, the cargo, and the window appeared frequently throughout the entries. Morrison realized he had stumbled upon something significant. The dates, the documents, and the newspaper clippings all pointed to a connection with the famous unsolved mail robbery. He contacted Maria Santos, the property owner, to inform her of the discovery. Santos, a retired teacher with a keen interest in local history, immediately recognized the potential importance of the materials. Together, they decided to contact the Aurora Police Department. Detective Lisa Chang, assigned to the Property Crimes Unit, responded to the call. Chang had heard about the 1973 Denver mail robbery during her training, but had never worked on the case directly. The discovery of potentially related materials 5 decades later was unprecedented in her experience. Chang documented the scene, photographed the materials, and secured them as potential evidence. She contacted the Denver Police Department's Cold Case Unit, which maintained custody of the original investigation files. Detective Marcus Reed, a veteran investigator with the Cold Case team, arrived at the duplex within hours of Chang's call. Reed examined the discovered materials with growing excitement. The postal routing documents contained information that had never been made public during the original investigation. The handwritten notes referenced specific details about truck schedules and security procedures that only someone with inside access could have known. The notebook entries, while cryptic, suggested detailed planning over a period of months. The handwriting analysis would require forensic examination, but Reed's initial assessment suggested the materials were authentic. The paper quality, ink composition, and aging patterns were consistent with documents from the 1970s. The level of detail in the Postal Service information indicated access to classified materials that would have been restricted to authorized personnel. One entry in the notebook stood out to Reed immediately. Dated August 12, 1973, just 2 days before the robbery, it read, "Final confirmation received. Route 7 carrying maximum load Tuesday morning. Sinclair and Reeves assigned as scheduled. Window opens at 7:10, closes at 7:25, no changes to protocol." The entry demonstrated precise knowledge of the robbery target and timing. Reed contacted the FBI's Denver field office to inform them of the discovery. Agent Sarah Mitchell, who had taken over the cold case from the original investigators, arrived at the duplex that afternoon. Mitchell had been working cold cases for 8 years and had reviewed the mail robbery file multiple times without finding new leads. The attic discovery represented the first significant development in the case since the 1970s. The materials were transported to the FBI's forensic laboratory for comprehensive analysis. Fingerprint examination, handwriting comparison, and document authentication would take several weeks to complete. But the initial assessment was promising. The documents appeared genuine, and their content suggested they had been created by someone directly involved in planning the robbery. The discovery raised immediate questions about the duplex's history. Property records showed the building had been owned by the same family from 1962 to 1998, when it was sold to a property management company. The original owners, Harold and Dorothy Kimmel, had both passed away in the 1990s. Their son, David Kimmel, had inherited the property but sold it quickly due to financial difficulties. Investigators began tracing the duplex's rental history, looking for tenants who might have had access to the attic space. The property management company's records were incomplete, but they showed a succession of short-term renters throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Most had stayed less than 2 years, and many had paid rent in cash, leaving minimal paper trails. One name from the rental records immediately caught Reed's attention. In November 1973, just 3 months after the robbery, a tenant named Michael Torres had rented the west unit of the duplex. Torres had paid 6 months' rent in advance and had specifically requested a unit with attic access for storage purposes. He had lived in the duplex for exactly 1 year before disappearing without notice, forfeiting his security deposit. Torres had provided minimal information on his rental application. The Social Security number was later determined to be fabricated, and the previous address led to a vacant lot. The property management company had been lax in their screening process, accepting cash payments without proper verification. Torres had essentially been a ghost tenant, living in the duplex without leaving any official traces. The timing of Torres's tenancy was significant. He had moved into the duplex shortly after the robbery and had left exactly 1 year later. The sealed attic compartment had been professionally constructed, suggesting someone with construction skills and access to materials. The location was perfect for hiding evidence or planning materials, isolated and unlikely to be discovered during routine maintenance. Reed began searching for any official records connected to Michael Torres. The name appeared in several databases, but none of the entries matched the physical description provided by the duplex's former neighbors. Most of the Michael Torres records were either too old or too young to match the tenant from 1973. The man had likely been using a false identity, carefully constructed to avoid detection. The notebook's final entries, dated in October 1973, were particularly intriguing. They referenced package secured and trail eliminated. The handwriting became increasingly hurried in the later entries, suggesting urgency or stress. The final entry, dated October 28, 1973, simply read, "Time to disappear. Everything buried. No one will ever find it." But someone had found it. After 51 years of silence, the attic had finally given up its secrets. The materials discovered by Morrison and Chen represented the first concrete evidence linking a specific individual to the 1973 Denver mail robbery. The forensic analysis would determine the authenticity of the documents and potentially identify their author through handwriting comparison. The discovery also raised the possibility that additional evidence might exist. If Torres had been one of the perpetrators, he might have hidden other materials in different locations. The notebook references to packages suggested multiple caches of evidence or stolen goods. The investigation was about to expand beyond the confines of the Aurora duplex. For Detective Reed, the attic discovery represented a career-defining moment. He had worked dozens of cold cases without achieving a breakthrough of this magnitude. The 1973 mail robbery had been considered unsolvable, a perfect crime that had defied decades of professional investigation. Now, thanks to a contractor's sledgehammer and a sealed attic compartment, the case was very much alive again. The handwriting in the notebook would soon be compared to samples from the original investigation. If a match could be established, it would provide the first concrete lead in over 5 decades. The name Michael Torres, whether real or fabricated, would be traced through every available database. The duplex would be searched for additional hidden compartments. And somewhere in the accumulated evidence, investigators hoped to find the key that would finally unlock the mystery of the missing $2.7 million. The forensic laboratory results arrived 3 weeks later, and they changed everything. The handwriting analysis confirmed what Detective Reed had suspected from the beginning. The precise, methodical script found in the notebook matched samples from the original investigation, specifically a personnel file that had been overlooked for decades. The author of the hidden documents wasn't Michael Torres at all. The name belonged to someone who had been hiding in plain sight since 1973. Agent Sarah Mitchell spread the laboratory report across her desk, her pulse quickening as she read the findings. The handwriting belonged to Dennis Hartwell, a former Postal Service supervisor who had been interviewed during the original investigation, but never considered a serious suspect. Hartwell had provided what seemed like cooperation, answering questions about security protocols and personnel assignments without raising suspicion. His alibi for the morning of August 14th had been solid, corroborated by multiple witnesses who placed him at his downtown office during the robbery. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The notebook discovered in the attic contained Hartwell's distinctive handwriting, characterized by specific letter formations and pressure patterns that made it virtually impossible to fake. The postal routing documents bore his annotations, and several entries in the notebook referenced meetings and observations that only someone in his position could have made. Dennis Hartwell hadn't just been a witness to the investigation. He had been the architect of the crime itself. The revelation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Hartwell had been the inside man, the source of the detailed intelligence that had made the robbery possible. His position as a postal supervisor had given him access to classified routing information, cargo manifests, and security protocols. He had known exactly when the high-value shipment would be traveling through Denver, and he had provided that information to his accomplices. Mitchell immediately launched a comprehensive background investigation into Hartwell's life and career. The man had worked for the Postal Service for 12 years before the robbery, maintaining a clean record and earning regular promotions. He had been married with 2 young children, living in a modest ranch house in suburban Denver. On the surface, he appeared to be the model federal employee, dedicated to his job and committed to his family. But beneath that facade, Hartwell had been struggling with mounting financial pressures. His wife had required expensive medical treatment for a chronic illness, and his children's educational needs had stretched the family budget to its breaking point. His Postal Service salary, while adequate for basic living expenses, hadn't been sufficient to cover the mounting medical bills and other financial obligations. The notebook entries revealed the evolution of Hartwell's criminal plan. Early entries from June 1973 showed a man wrestling with moral and practical considerations. He had initially explored legal options for addressing his financial crisis, including loans, second mortgages, and additional employment opportunities. But as his wife's medical condition worsened and the bills continued to accumulate, he had begun considering more desperate measures. The first reference to the robbery plan appeared in a July entry. Opportunity presents itself regularly. Question is whether I have the courage to act. The system has vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with inside knowledge. The language was careful, almost academic, suggesting Hartwell had been thinking through the criminal enterprise as if it were a business problem requiring a solution. Subsequent entries showed increasing detail and commitment. Hartwell had begun documenting truck routes, driver assignments, and cargo values. He had identified patterns in the security protocols and noted gaps in the surveillance coverage. Most importantly, he had begun reaching out to potential accomplices, individuals who could provide the muscle and equipment necessary to execute the robbery. The notebook revealed that Hartwell had recruited 3 men for the operation: Vincent Caruso, a former military police officer with weapons training; Ray Delacroix, a mechanic with access to untraceable vehicles; and Marcus Webb, a construction worker with demolition skills. The 4 men had met regularly throughout July and early August, refining their plan and preparing for the heist. Hartwell's role had been to provide intelligence and create the conditions necessary for success. He had adjusted the truck schedule to ensure the target vehicle would be carrying maximum cargo, and he had arranged for the usual security escorts to be reassigned to other duties. His insider knowledge had eliminated most of the variables that typically caused robberies to fail. The execution of the robbery had proceeded exactly as planned. Caruso and Delacroix had intercepted the postal truck using authentic uniforms and identification provided by Hartwell. Webb had driven the getaway vehicle and provided security during the cash transfer. The entire operation had taken less than 15 minutes, and the perpetrators had vanished without leaving any recoverable evidence. The notebook's most revealing entries came in the weeks following the robbery. Hartwell had documented the division of the stolen money and the steps taken to launder the proceeds. Each conspirator had received approximately $675,000, a fortune that required careful handling to avoid detection. The notebook showed detailed planning for converting the cash into untraceable assets and establishing new identities for the participants. Hartwell's own financial transformation had been gradual and carefully orchestrated. He had continued working at the Postal Service for another 2 years, maintaining his normal lifestyle while secretly investing his share of the robbery proceeds. The notebook revealed a complex network of offshore accounts, real estate purchases, and business investments designed to legitimize the stolen money over time. The investigation team began tracing the financial records of all 4 conspirators. Vincent Caruso had disappeared from Denver shortly after the robbery, his trail going cold in Las Vegas, where he had allegedly started a security consulting business. Ray Delacroix had moved to Phoenix and opened an auto repair shop, paying cash for the property and equipment. Marcus Webb had relocated to Seattle, where he had launched a construction company that had grown suspiciously quickly. Only Dennis Hartwell had remained in Denver, hiding in plain sight while building a new life on the foundation of stolen federal money. His wife's medical bills had been quietly paid off, and his children had attended private schools without any obvious source of additional income. He had purchased a larger home in an upscale neighborhood, explaining the upgrade as the result of careful savings and a small inheritance from a deceased relative. The notebook's final entries, dating from October 1973, revealed Hartwell's growing paranoia about the ongoing FBI investigation. He had become increasingly concerned about the thoroughness of the federal inquiry and the possibility that one of his accomplices might be identified. The decision to hide the planning documents in the Aurora duplex had been an insurance policy, a way to preserve evidence that could implicate his partners if he were ever caught. The choice of the duplex had been strategic. Hartwell had known the property's owner, Harold Kimmel, through a mutual friend, and had learned that the building had an accessible attic space. The Michael Torres identity had been carefully constructed, using fabricated documents and cash payments to avoid creating any connection to his real name. He had lived in the duplex for exactly 1 year, long enough to establish the hidden compartment and ensure the documents would remain undisturbed. Detective Reed's investigation revealed that Hartwell had died in 1994, taking his secrets to the grave. His obituary had described him as a devoted family man and longtime Postal Service employee who had contributed significantly to his community. There had been no mention of any criminal activity or suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. He had successfully maintained his false identity for over 2 decades. The discovery of Hartwell's role in the robbery opened new avenues for investigation. His 3 accomplices had scattered across the country, but their identities were now known. Financial records from the 1970s and 1980s could be examined for evidence of the laundered robbery proceeds. Property purchases, business investments, and lifestyle changes could be traced to determine how the stolen money had been integrated into the legitimate economy. Agent Mitchell coordinated with FBI field offices in Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Seattle to locate records related to the 3 suspects. The investigation would require extensive document analysis, financial forensics, and witness interviews. But for the first time in 5 decades, investigators had concrete leads and specific individuals to pursue. The impact of the discovery extended beyond the immediate investigation. The case had demonstrated how a single piece of hidden evidence could resurrect even the most thoroughly investigated crimes. The Aurora duplex had preserved crucial information that had been invisible to investigators for over half a century, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it to light. For the families of the original postal workers, the breakthrough brought mixed emotions. Robert Sinclair had passed away in 2003, never knowing that his attacker had been identified. Danny Reeves, now in his 80s, learned about the discovery through a phone call from Detective Reed. The news provided closure about the identity of the perpetrators, but it also reopened old wounds about the trauma he had experienced. The investigation continued expanding as new leads emerged from the notebook's detailed entries. References to additional hidden caches suggested that other evidence might be waiting to be discovered. The financial trail left by the 4 conspirators would require months of analysis to fully unravel, and somewhere in the accumulated evidence, investigators hoped to find traces of the missing $2.7 million that had never been recovered. The case had transformed from a legendary unsolved crime into an active investigation with identified suspects and concrete evidence. The attic discovery had shattered 5 decades of silence, proving that even the most carefully planned crimes could be undone by time, chance, and the persistence of investigators who refused to give up on justice. The revelation that Dennis Hartwell had been the mastermind behind the 1973 Denver mail robbery sent investigators racing to piece together the final chapters of a crime that had haunted law enforcement for over 5 decades. With 3 accomplices now identified and a detailed notebook serving as their roadmap, the investigation took on new urgency. The question was no longer who had committed the perfect crime, but whether justice could still be served after so many years had passed. Agent Sarah Mitchell's team worked methodically through Hartwell's notebook, cross-referencing entries with historical records and tracking down surviving witnesses. The financial trail proved particularly revealing. Bank records from the 1970s, stored in microfilm archives, showed patterns of cash deposits and investments that aligned perfectly with the notebook's documentation. Each of the 4 conspirators had followed similar strategies, converting their stolen proceeds into legitimate assets over a period of several years. Vincent Caruso's Las Vegas security consulting business had been funded entirely with cash payments, a red flag that investigators had missed during the original inquiry. Property records showed he had purchased a downtown office building in 1975, paying $340,000 in cash for what appeared to be a legitimate business investment. The timing and amount strongly suggested laundered robbery proceeds, but Caruso had covered his tracks well. He had died in 1988, his business empire intact, and his criminal past unknown to his family. Ray Delacroix's Phoenix Auto Repair Shop told a similar story. The initial purchase of the property and equipment had required a cash investment of over $400,000, far exceeding what a former Denver mechanic could have legitimately accumulated. Financial records showed steady expansion of the business throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with Delacroix eventually becoming one of Phoenix's most successful automotive entrepreneurs. He had passed away in 2001, leaving behind a multi-million-dollar estate built on the foundation of stolen federal money. Marcus Webb's Seattle construction company had grown even more dramatically. Starting with a cash investment of $450,000 in 1974, Webb had built a regional empire that had dominated commercial construction throughout the Pacific Northwest. His company had erected shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments across 3 states. Webb had died in 2009, his obituary describing him as a self-made businessman who had achieved the American dream through hard work and determination. The irony was inescapable. 3 of the 4 conspirators had used their shares of the stolen money to build legitimate businesses that had contributed significantly to their communities. They had created jobs, paid taxes, and supported local charities, all while hiding their criminal origins. The robbery that had traumatized 2 postal workers and embarrassed federal law enforcement had inadvertently funded decades of economic development across the American West. Detective Reed's investigation revealed that the statute of limitations had long since expired for the original robbery charges. Even if the 3 accomplices had still been alive, prosecution would have been impossible under federal law. The crime had been too old, the evidence too circumstantial, and the legal framework too restrictive to support criminal charges. The case would remain technically unsolved, despite the wealth of evidence discovered in the Aurora duplex. But the investigation had achieved something more valuable than prosecution. It had provided answers to questions that had puzzled investigators for generations. The precision of the robbery, the inside knowledge of postal procedures, and the complete absence of physical evidence all made sense once Hartwell's role was understood. The crime hadn't been perfect because the perpetrators were exceptionally skilled. It had been perfect because one of them had been positioned to eliminate every possible source of failure. The notebook's final entries revealed Hartwell's ultimate fate and his reasons for preserving the evidence. By October 1973, he had become increasingly paranoid about the ongoing investigation. FBI agents had interviewed him multiple times, and he had begun to suspect that his cover might be compromised. The decision to hide the planning documents had been motivated by fear rather than criminal pride. He had wanted insurance against his accomplices, evidence that could implicate them if he were ever caught and needed to negotiate. The Aurora duplex had been chosen specifically because it provided long-term security for the hidden materials. Hartwell had known that the building's owner was elderly and unlikely to undertake major renovations. The attic space was rarely accessed, and the sealed compartment had been constructed to withstand decades of neglect. He had planned to retrieve the documents if circumstances changed, but he had never returned to the duplex after his 1-year tenancy ended. The investigation team spent months analyzing every aspect of the case, from the original crime scene evidence to the financial records of the 4 conspirators. The notebook had provided a detailed blueprint of the robbery, but it had also revealed the human cost of the crime. Hartwell's wife had died in 1982, her medical bills having been paid with stolen federal money. His children had grown up benefiting from their father's criminal enterprise, attending private schools without ever knowing the true source of their advantages. The discovery had profound implications for the families of all those involved. The children of the 3 deceased accomplices learned that their father's business success had been built on theft and deception. The revelation destroyed carefully constructed family narratives and forced painful reckonings with inherited wealth that had criminal origins. For the Postal Service, the case closure brought both satisfaction and embarrassment. The revelation that one of their own supervisors had orchestrated the robbery forced a comprehensive review of internal security procedures. The agency implemented new oversight mechanisms and background screening protocols designed to prevent future insider threats. The case became a training example for security professionals, demonstrating how institutional trust could be exploited by determined criminals. The FBI officially closed the case in December 2024, exactly 51 years after the original crime. The final report acknowledged that while no prosecutions were possible, the investigation had successfully identified all 4 perpetrators and traced the disposition of the stolen money. The case was reclassified as solved but not prosecuted, joining a small category of historical crimes that had been resolved through evidence rather than courtroom convictions. The Aurora duplex where the breakthrough had occurred became an unlikely landmark in criminal justice history. Maria Santos, the property owner, completed her renovation project, but preserved the attic compartment where the documents had been hidden. She installed a small plaque commemorating the discovery, turning the space into an informal museum of the case. The duplex attracted visitors from the law enforcement community, curious about the hiding place that had preserved crucial evidence for over 5 decades. Detective Reed retired shortly after the case was closed, his career defined by the resolution of one of Colorado's most famous unsolved crimes. He had demonstrated that persistence, modern forensic techniques, and simple chance could combine to solve even the most carefully planned criminal enterprises. The case had shown that time could be an ally rather than an enemy for investigators willing to wait for the right evidence to surface. The story of the 1973 Denver mail robbery had finally reached its conclusion, not in a courtroom, but in the careful documentation of truth. The perfect crime had been undone by a contractor's sledgehammer, a sealed attic compartment, and the methodical notes of a man who had never imagined his secrets would outlive him. The missing $2.7 million had never been recovered, but its path through the American economy had been traced and documented. The money had built businesses, funded educations, and supported communities across the country, transformed from stolen federal funds into legitimate economic activity. The robbery had achieved its immediate goal of enriching its perpetrators, but it had also demonstrated the complex ways that crime could ripple through society, creating both victims and unintended beneficiaries across generations. In the end, the Aurora duplex had done more than reveal the identity of 4 long-dead criminals. It had shown that truth, like evidence, could survive decades of concealment, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the light. The case had closed, but its lessons would endure, reminding investigators that even the most perfect crimes contain the seeds of their own eventual undoing.